You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Sputnik International reports U.S. leaders pushing for three-front war when they can't handle one. On Monday, a bipartisan group of U.S. representatives visited Taiwan against the protests of Beijing, promising Taiwanese lawmakers that the U.S.-supplied weapons would be coming soon and publicly warning China from invading the island. Are these jingoistic actions for American domestic consumption? Because I see U.S. actions and warnings as antagonistic and provocative, not preventative. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. And there's also a new book, which I think will be out next week. And the title of that book is, sir?
Armed Struggle with a Question Mark. Panthers and Communists, Black nationalists and liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
That's the voice and brilliance of Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So the meeting, which included the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Michael McCaul, a Republican from Texas, was the latest in a string of meetings between U.S. and Taiwanese officials that have taken place during the Biden administration. The saber rattling of China by the U.S. is insanity, as it cannot handle the crisis it is already facing. Dr. Horne, that goes back to my question. Are these jingoistic actions really more for domestic consumption, and I'll also add, to support this escalation in the sale of weapons? Because again, I see these actions as being provocative. The U.S. is saying, don't invade Taiwan, and China's response is, we weren't even thinking about, talking about, or planning to invade Taiwan. Dr. Horne.
Well, certainly the military-industrial complex has to be considered. You don't have to be a stock-picking genius to figure out that the share price of corporations like Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics will be going through the roof as a result of this jingoism in Washington. But it's actually more than that, because if you consult the book by the Yale historian Paul Kennedy, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, he sketches the concept of imperial overstretch. And that suggests that when empires reach a certain point, they basically overreach. And you see that, or you saw that with Great Britain and the British Empire. That is to say, was confronting Berlin and Tokyo simultaneously. But that was not enough. After World War II ended, with Britain basically reeling from pillar to post, it joined its comrade in the Netherlands in a failed attempt to keep Indonesia, now the fourth or fifth largest country on planet Earth, under wraps. But even that was not enough. In 1956, it joined Israel and France in a failed attempt to overthrow Nasser in Egypt in order to control the Suez Canal. And then, thoroughly chagrined and humiliated, it passed the baton of world dominance on to its NATO allies, speaking of the United States, which has done its best imitation of the British Empire in decline that we have seen to this point. But alas, the United States will not have an opportunity, I'm afraid to say, to have a rather smooth and seamless passing the baton on to a rising China, not only because that would conflict with U.S. ideology in terms of acceding to the largest communist party on planet Earth with 90 million plus members, a party that is larger than most nations. But not only that, it would violate the premises of white supremacy to pass the baton on to the most populous nation, or the second most populous nation on planet Earth after India, and of course an Asian nation to boot. Not only that, but you now see that Washington's Asian allies are hedging. That's the import of the trilateral summit held this week between China, Japan, and South Korea. Many of us had begun to suspect that Japan was firmly in the camp of U.S. imperialism. That was the import of this harebrained idea of establishing a NATO office in Tokyo, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Obviously, these chaps from NATO don't know geography. But you see that Japan is hedging because it can see which way the winds are blowing and does not want to be caught out on a limb with U.S. imperialism. The same holds true for South Korea. And like Japan, China is its largest trading partner. At the same time, you see that its neighbor to the north, speaking of North Korea, has turned, shall we say, rather hostile towards its neighbor to the south, speaking of Seoul. And that has caused South Korea to try to influence China, which it feels has influence with North Korea. And so if you look at that particular scenario and then begin to survey all of the disasters and humiliations that U.S. imperialism has suffered over the decades, including not being able to overthrow the DPRK during the war in Korea in 1950 to 1953, the failed attempt to control Vietnam, leading to an ignominious retreat in 1975, the apparent successful overthrow of Saddam Hussein in the early 21st century, then being bogged down in various conflicts that continue to percolate. Keep in mind that in addition to its ally Israel facing encirclement by the Yemenis and the Hezbollah, not to mention the militant Hamas, you should not ignore the role of Iraqi militants as well in putting pressure on Israel. At the same time, if you want to say that Libya was a victory given the overthrow of Gaddafi, well, a victory like that is hardly a prize, given the fact of Libya's rather small population, not to mention that it has descended into chaos since the successful, quote-unquote, the U.S. overthrow. And so Washington is facing real dilemmas that are accentuated by the fact that it seemingly is going to tempt fate by, in the sense, threatening World War III. That's the import of what you see in this morning's New York Times concerning how the United States, in conjunction with Turkey, by the way, is building and has built a plant on the plains of Texas in order to develop artillery shells to ship to the battlefield of Ukraine, destined to be used against Russian forces. There is a debate going on in the administration, we are told by the New York Times, as to whether or not the Ukrainians will be authorized to attack deep inside Russia, which could obviously threaten World War III, to put it mildly. And it's apparent that when it comes to Russia, the United States has become more psychotic and harebrained than usual. That is to say that if one were a sober analyst of imperialism, and that's obviously difficult to conjure, but try if you might decide that you should, A, not tempt World War III, and B, you may want to focus on China. But apparently that makes too much sense with regard to how U.S. imperialism will proceed. And so now we are going to be visited by the spectacle of President Biden visiting Normandy, the beaches of Normandy, in a few days to mark the 80th anniversary of D-Day, June 1944, where the screws were placed upon Nazi Germany. But apparently, Washington has not learned the lesson of World War II, which was basically, in many ways, a result of pressure from the Red Army from the East, which obviously weakened Berlin's forces in the West. Instead, you're going to be treated, I'm afraid to say, to a lot of humbug, hot air, concerning speeches from Mr. Biden, President Macron, who has discovered his inner hawk, and all, of course, basically talking about rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic as this North Atlantic vessel heads towards an iceberg.
Yeah, let me ask you this: your thoughts on the effect of these conflicts on the other and on the worldwide reputation of U.S. imperialism? You know, Gaza. It's hard for the U.S. to continue to make the argument that they're doing, you know, interventions on behalf of good stuff as the world looks on aghast at, you know, the latest Rafah massacre. Other potential allies, such as Taiwan, et cetera, looking at Ukraine, saying, "Oh my God, we don't want to end up like them." So that the misadventures that they're involved in, how they affect the whole picture of U.S. imperialism worldwide.
Well, I think the question answers itself. We see severe reputational damage to U.S. imperialism and North Atlantic imperialism. You see this with regard to the International Criminal Court, wherein it brought a case or sought to bring a case against Moscow and was cheered on by the State Department as being an exemplar of the so-called rules-based international order. But when a case has been brought against Prime Minister Netanyahu and his war cabinet, including Mr. Gallant, all of a sudden, Washington begins to throw spitballs at the ICC and try to discredit it. And obviously, that leads to severe reputational damage for U.S. imperialism. But more than that, nature abhors a vacuum, and you see filling the vacuum is the leader of the world in waiting, speaking of China. That is to say, we are already familiar with how it helped to broker, ease tensions in an entente between Saudi Arabia and Iran in the last 12 to 24 months. We saw how earlier in May, they brokered a kind of entente between Hamas and Fatah and other Palestinian factions. As we speak, in China, unfolding is a China-Arab summit. And do not be surprised if coming out of this summit is a call for an international conference to try to move towards a settlement of this bleeding sore in Gaza, in Palestine. And once again, the U.S. administration has to watch its back, because I'm sure you gentlemen, amongst others, paid attention to that massive solidarity conference that took place in Detroit, Michigan, in the past few days, which bids fair to unleash and enhance and reinvigorate a Palestinian solidarity movement in Hamtramck, Michigan, which is a kind of suburb of Detroit. You saw the city council just endorse boycott, divestment, and sanction. I dare say that that's the first of a number of legislative bodies that will be moving in that direction. And so you see that U.S. imperialism is being pressed on all fronts. It's being discredited on the international front because of its standing by its rather daffy ally, that is Israel. And then at home, it's being pressed by these campus encampments. The fact that students are on strike in a number of University of California campuses, along with the workers organized under the banner of the United Auto Workers. And so this is a real crisis for U.S. imperialism that will probably come to a crescendo in August when the Democratic Party convention convenes in Chicago, where there might be a replay of 1968, where you might recall that anti-war protesters gathered in the streets and were subjected to bloody violence by the Chicago Police Department, which was just another black eye for U.S. imperialism, leading inevitably to its present crisis that we're enduring today.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis. And we look forward to having you back.